I've dragged Preston along with me today. A lot of y'all know him from school and whatnot. This is my oldest offspring. And so he's got a song he'd like to share with you.
Got to throw it right out. That's it. Let's see. First, let's make sure we're connected to the speaker. Yep, and we're connected. No, that's not the song, is it? Okay. Mama, you can see the title of her sermon is about hope, dealing with hope, and try to put that right there. Few things, well, talking about biblically related especially, a few things inspire more hope in myself, but there we go. Few things inspire more hope in me than hearing about the miracles that Jesus performed, and the greatest miracles, in my opinion, that Jesus performed is when he brought people back from the dead. And he does this a few times. And so this first song is called My Name is Lazarus. I heard it done by a group called Greater Vision. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with Greater Vision. They're a Southern gospel trio mostly. And but anyway, and it kind of tells a story about some people that came together to try to heal this one gentleman, and the few of them are doubtful that Jesus could actually heal this guy. But then again, one of the gentlemen is Lazarus, and he's like, "He brought me back from the dead. I think he can heal this person." So I'm going to try to get through this. It's a lot of words, so I printed my words out. Try to get through this. All right, let's see how the volume does on this one. Is that okay? One day 4 men brought a crippled man to Jesus. Still and lifeless he laid upon his bed. He had not moved since he was just a baby. Still he longed to become a normal man. Now we don't know much about the men that carried the corners of his tattered bed that day. But if we may create an illustration, we'll see what these men might have had to say. Suppose that first man said, "I hate to doubt it, though Jesus touched my eyes when I was blind, and he made me see, and there's no doubt about it. But this man's needs are more serious than mine." Suppose that second man said, "No need to bother, this man's condition will remain the same. Though Jesus touched my hand when it was withered, I don't believe he can heal a man so lame." Suppose that third man said, "I hate to question, though no one here is more skeptical than me. Though Jesus cleansed me when I was a leper, this helpless man will never walk, you see." Then every eye was turned to the fourth man to see how he might criticize and doubt. But all 3 men were startled with amazement when that fourth man stopped and he said his name out loud. He said, "My name is Lazarus. Can I testify? My name is Lazarus. It feels good to be alive. When I in chains of death was bound, this man named Jesus pulled me out. If you think your little problem is too big for him to solve, take it from the one who's heard the mighty voice of God, a living testimony of his death-defying touch. My name is Lazarus. My name is Lazarus, now can I testify? My name is Lazarus, feels good to be alive. When I in chains of death was bound, this man named Jesus just pulled me out. If you think your little problem is too big for him to solve, take it from the one who's heard the mighty voice of God, a living testimony of his death-defying touch. My name is Lazarus. I'm a living testimony of his death-defying touch. Okay.
I always like that song, so I ask him to sing it sometimes. So when I'm thinking about, preparing a sermon or whatever, I just keep a file of random notes and interesting things in my phone or my iPad or whatever. I was thinking about the subject of hope not too long ago. And then I have a little Thursday morning kind of Bible study, book study group that meets on Zoom. If anybody's interested in joining up with that, you can. But it came up the other day, what kinds of things undermine your faith? What makes it difficult for you to hang on to your faith? And anyway, one thing that came to me was negativity tends to undermine our sense of hope and our faith. And so I was thinking about how many people do you think, how do we feel about the future? Are we frustrated? Do we feel worried or afraid or concerned or hopeful? How do we feel about the future? In the Apostle Paul says, in several places, but in a couple of places in Romans, he says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope." Now, this is a man who was beaten and imprisoned, and all kinds of things happened to him. He also says, "Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer." So being hopeful is our job as Christians, I think, but oftentimes that's pretty difficult to achieve. And when I think about what undermines faith, the negativity, where that comes from, I think it largely comes from fear, all kinds of complicated fears in our lives. And fear is a persistent topic in the Bible. It is mentioned in one form or another over 400 times, and over 100 times we have the direct command, don't be afraid or fear not. And so I think Jesus certainly knew the impact of fear on us. A recent study found that 1 in 5 of us has an anxiety disorder. 1 in 5 people, statistically. And we spend over $2 billion a year on anti-anxiety medications as a country. And that was in a book I was reading, which was a couple years old, so it may be even more now. So holding on to hope is pretty difficult in today's world, and sometimes, or mostly all the times, I think our response to events is colored by the diet we consume of news. My own personal experience is, 2 or 3 years ago, maybe longer, I decided that watching the news every day was not doing my mental health any good. And it really was not stuff I needed to know. By and large, it wasn't important stuff. So I quit doing that. I said, okay, if I were eating something that gave me heartburn every time I ate it, I would stop eating it. And this is giving me mental heartburn every time I watch it, so it's straight out. So, but I don't want to be like a total loser and not know what's going on in the world. So I had this little CNN app on my phone. I have BBC and, New York Times, some other ones. But every morning I would kind of check in the CNN app to see what the headlines were. And after I did that, I felt bad. I said, I just feel bad. That makes me unhappy to do that. And when I analyzed it, every news outfit chooses what it puts what it puts out there. Out of all the news that's happening in the world, they make these choices. And they make the choice of how they do it. And so I decided that CNN, the way they were doing their little app, was not for me. So I quit that. And I think that negativity in the news makes us feel like these are the worst of times. One comment I often make is, why don't you have a chat with somebody who was around during the rationing after the Second World War? And there are a few of them still around. My mother was a kid when that was happening. There are people around who remember those times. They might have said, why don't you talk to a Holocaust survivor, see how they feel about this being the worst of times. So it's all a matter of perspective, I think, and it depends on who you listen to, but it's really important what we're feeding our minds and our souls with. I think that makes a lot of difference in whether we feel hopeful. So if we turn to the Bible, which ought to be a place we turn every time, right? I'd like to read some selected verses from Psalm 27 as kind of a foundational passage. I love Psalm 27. It says some of my favorite stuff. So it says, this is the NRSV version. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? One thing I ask of the Lord, this I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. I also ran across a book by Adam Hamilton, who's one of my favorite writers, and he's a United Methodist pastor out in Kansas. And this book is entitled Unafraid, Living with Courage and Hope in Uncertain Times. And he has this little acrostic, you can see it on your screen, and I asked Lisa to put it in the bulletin so you could take it home with you if you wanted. But this acrostic tells us first to face our fears with faith. So identifying our fears is important. And it helps us if we have that sort of muddle of emotions and reactions where we're afraid, but we're not quite sure what we're afraid of. We just have this general kind of yucky feeling about things. In the book, and I'm not talking about being afraid of snakes or spiders or whatever, but in the book, he takes up things like fear of crime, fear based on race, terrorism, fear of terrorism, a fear of failure, and a fear of disappointing other people, fear of loneliness, fear around finances, fear of change, and a fear of missing out, fears about age and illness and dying, and some other stuff is in that book. It's a really good book if you want to. Adam Hamilton is a very clear writer. He has a really good way of taking things apart and looking at them. And there's quite a catalog of things we fear, right? But there is power in being able to name those fears. So face your fears is one thing. And in verse 1 of Psalm 27, if you look back, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? So if we can face it with that kind of faith and identify our fears, I think there's a power there. And we're trusting that God is in control. If you find yourself feeling anxious and can't really put words to your fears, talk to somebody, a therapist, your pastor, other people. Just kind of sound it out. Sometimes just talking about it will bring things up that you hadn't thought about. So facing our fears is important. The second thing is examine your assumptions in the light of facts. Now, when I was a kid, knowing what the facts were about something seemed like a relatively easy thing to do. I was that kid who was constantly in the library looking stuff up in an encyclopedia. I am in love with my little computer in my pocket. I'm forever looking something up. What does this word mean? How do you say this? What is this thing? I'll look up stuff. But it's a little, and just for good measure, watch Walter Cronkite at night and read the Daily Advance or the Virginian Pilot if we needed to know what was going on. It seemed kind of easy then. But it is quite possible to know what the facts are, even today. I know when Selena and I were teaching, we spent a lot of time trying to teach students how to go find reliable sources of information, because there is a lot of junk out there. And social media is junkier than most of it. The old, I saw it on TV or I saw it on Facebook, not necessarily a good thing there. But so you have to kind of look at the facts. One thing that's in the Adam Hamilton book that I found really interesting is he says that one topic he talks about is fear for our security. 53% of Americans at the time they did the survey said that they worry a great deal about crime and violence. And another 26% of them said they worry a fair amount, which gives a total of 79% of people are worrying at least a fair amount about crime and violence. And if you listen to some of the news sources and politicians and whoever, it would seem like we have more crime now than we've ever had. However, the fact is, and this is based on the Bureau of Justice statistics and the FBI statistics, violent crime rates have reduced by half since the 1990s, and the murder rate is dropped to a level it was in 1964. You would not know that listening to the news, right? Because what they choose to report is a shooting here and a shooting there, you know. But in point of fact, if you take the statistics, now that's not to minimize a crime when it happens in your community or to you, but statistically, there's some of our fears about that are kind of baseless. He has a chapter in the book called Paralyzed, a mile before the promised land, a mile from the promised land. This is about a story in Numbers. In Numbers, the Israelites are about a mile before the border of Canaan, right? And they're camped out there. So they decide to send 12 spies into the land of Canaan to see what it's like. 10 of them come back and says, there are giants over there. We can't go over there. There's giants in that place. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, come back and they say, it's not so bad. The Lord is with us. It's a great place, plenty of things to eat and all that. But the powers that be decide that they're not going to take a chance. They camped for 38 years, 1 mile from the promised land, because they were afraid to go into it. But finally, at last, Caleb and Joshua lead them in there. So sometimes our assumptions about things, our giants are out there, and they cause us to be paralyzed. I know that, and I know Selena and Sheila and others who've been teachers, Becky, all of us, maybe not so much with little elementary kids, but you know, you hear a lot about how horrible high school kids are. Gay, you've been out there, a bunch of us have been in. But you know, high school kids are kids like they always were. People would say to me, I don't know how you stand to teach in high school. I'm like, they're just kids, they're people, they're just like I was when I was in high school pretty much. I found more of them needing love, more of them that maybe weren't being parented and that wanted somebody to love them and listen to them. I did find that. But I could count on one hand, and maybe not even that many, of kids who were mean-spirited people. Almost none. Most of the ones who acted really badly grew up to be okay after a while. And that was fine. I see them in the grocery store, and they run over and give me a big hug. Miss Murray, I'm like, you gave me a lot of grief back in the day. But, you know, they're not bad. But, you know, the image, the idea that they're bad is what's out there, and people believe it. Sadly, people believe it, and they don't want to go into the school to volunteer or whatever because they're afraid. And it's a giant that needs to be faced, you know, and sometimes it's baseless. The third thing is to attack your anxieties with action. So again, one action you can do is to volunteer, to get out there, to get amongst people, face those fears and attack and do something. I know there's loads of volunteer opportunities in this county. You can deliver Meals on Wheels, you can work at the food bank, you can volunteer in the schools, you can volunteer at the Y, you can do all kinds of things. Volunteer at the animal shelter. There's tons of ways of getting yourself out there and serving like Jesus served, being with people, being around people. Prayer is definitely an action. You know, in Psalm 27 it says, "Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek." Pray about stuff that you worry about, and then see where that takes you. And get involved in your community and your church. It'll help you put things in perspective. I was in the pool the other day. I teach a water fitness class at the Y, and one of the people, she's moved here from someplace else. She was really concerned about voting because she said she was afraid of violence at the polls. I said, "Honey, you're in Currituck. I don't think you're going to have to worry about this too much." I've said I work at the Coinjock precinct. I said my little precinct is kind and gentle. It's a good little precinct, and I don't think we have to worry a whole lot about. But listening to news and so many people talking about it is not even based on any kind of reality that's around. So go vote. I don't think you're going to have a problem. But if you're worried about it, go vote early in the courthouse where you're surrounded by law enforcement and every other body up there. But yeah, so, if you look around, just look around you. Look in your own community. We are a community that bands together. If something bad happens, people are all on board to try to help, right? And we don't care what people's politics are. We're a helping place, and that's a wonderful thing to have. And so I think we can gain some perspective. The other thing that we can do is look at history. I was mentioning, talk to people who were around. Talk to 90-year-old people and see what they think. Get a perspective on things. And the other thing is to read. Like one more interesting person that I've read about is, she's called Jeanne of Norwich. She lived in or attached to the cathedral at Norwich, England, in the latter half of the 1300s on into the early 1400s. And she had visions. Excuse me. Swallowed some dust. She had visions where Jesus spoke to her, and she wrote them down. It's called Showings. And it's, in fact, the first book that remains existing by a woman in England. Just FYI. But she says, but she was very keenly aware of what was going on in her world. At the time she was living and writing the Showings, her visions were all about just the incredible, powerful love of God, how God is total love, and Jesus is love. The bubonic plague was raging during her lifetime. The Archbishop of Canterbury was assassinated, so that was like the main church structure was thrown into disarray. There were 3 popes who kept excommunicating each other, so that was in a mess. The 100 Years' War between England and France was dragging along. All of these things were going on. And she had a little hermitage out there kind of attached to the cathedral at Norwich where she let people come and talk. She kind of became a sort of a counselor sort of a person. And she had to have heard every kind of personal ailment and whatever was going on with people. But her most famous quote, the one that you might see somewhere, is, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." That's Jeanne of Norwich's quote there. So, when you're looking at actions, read the Bible. Read the lives of people that have overcome their fears. And in the song that Preston did and the one he's going to do, it talks about people who've overcome fear and hopelessness to have hope in the situation with Lazarus. And then at the end, when I'm finished talking here, Press is going to sing a song based on the story in Mark 5 about Jairus' daughter. He was a leader of the synagogue, came to Jesus and said, "Can you come and heal my daughter?" And while he was talking to him, messengers came and said, "I'm sorry, your daughter already died." But Jesus says, "Let's go anyway." And the man had enough hope and enough faith that he went. And so the Bible is full of stories like that, all kinds of stories of hope in what looks like a hopeless situation. We have hope, of course, eternally, hope in the resurrection, but we also should have hope for now. I love the ending of Psalm Psalm 27, I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I do see goodness all around me, all the time. So the last thing is to release your cares to God. Julian Norwich said, God didn't say you will not be assailed, you will not be belabored, you will not be disquieted. But he said you will not be overcome. God loves us and delights in us, and so he wishes us to love him and delight in him and trust greatly in him, and all will be well. So I think if we name our fears, look at the facts to see if what we're fearing is maybe not a reality, serve like Christ would serve, and release our fears to God, I think we will live a hopeful life, a life of hope. So, Press, if you want to come and do this last song.
Yeah, like Mama said, this one revolves around the story where, Jairus, brought Jesus back to his house, and he resurrects the daughter that had just passed away, even amongst the naysayers and the people that didn't think it could happen, and said she's already dead. What are you doing? There's no need to bother. But Jesus says, hold my beer, and he steps up. This one is called The Promise. Different people have done it. I've heard different people do it amongst the Southern gospel artists. But anyway, it's another one. It spoke to me, and I really enjoy this one. The volume all right? That's good. A hand of fear gripped the crowd that day at Jairus' home, when the doctor shook his head and said, she's gone. You could feel that mother's heart break. You could hear them cry and mourn. Their little girl was only 12 years old. But somewhere in the distance, outlined against the sun, there came a man on a mission from the throne. They said, well, look, somebody's coming. But what they did not know, it was their promise coming down that dusty road. There's a promise coming down that dusty road. And from his holy hands, healing virtue flows. He's got the key to what you need. Death and hell he will defeat. There's a promise coming down that dusty road. Well, the wonder turned to mocking when Jesus did speak. He said, your daughter's not dead, she's just asleep. Then he turned to the unbelievers and he told them all, just gone home. He said, you just leave me in death alone. And I like this part. And then he laid his hands upon the child and he looked death right in the eye. He said, all power in heaven and earth, it belongs to me. And in a voice that sounds like thunder, he hurled death asunder when he said, my child, rise and be healed. There's a promise coming down that dusty road. And from his holy hands, healing virtue flows. He's got the key to what you need. Death and hell he will defeat. There's a promise coming down that dusty road. Well, there's a promise coming down your dusty road. and from his holy hands, yes, healing virtue flows. He's got the key to what you need. Death and hell he will defeat. There's a promise coming down your dusty road. He's got the key to what you need. Death and hell he will defeat. There's a promise coming down your dusty road. There's a promise coming down your dusty road.